Well. If this isn't your favorite podcaster, haven't seen each other for a while, haven't published anything for a year. For those of you listening in, I'm standing here outside of Macy's in the middle of downtown San Francisco. Beautiful sunny Friday afternoon. Everybody's in the TGIF mood. And I'm heading to our podcast guest today, founder and CTO of a company called Orb. Orb is an infrastructure billing company. They raised about 20 million. Greylock did the seed round in 2021, I think, and then Menlo came in for the Series A last year. So in this episode, we're going to talk about pricing AI products, which can be kind of complex if you're coming from a traditional SaaS subscription-based pricing, and suddenly you're linking into the foundational models, OpenAI and the like, and have usage-based pricing on the cost side, and sort of have to decide how to pass that on to your ultimate customers. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to take you to their offices. It's on Second and Market, and we're going to have a great episode here. All right, so I think this is it. You've seen me crossing a few red lights. It's because I'm late. Let me see if I can find the name here. There it is. A quick tour through the office.
Yeah, this is lunch area. All of our engineering team is here, so we're fully in office. We're here 4 days a week, totally in the office, and most people actually will come in for the extra day as well. But we really value the whiteboarding, and
Nice.
I think it's been a big part of our culture, even though we started during COVID. So that's been nice.
Wonderful. Welcome everyone. We're here in beautiful downtown San Francisco. It's a Friday sunny afternoon, and I'm here with Kshitij Grover, who's the co-founder and CTO of a company called Orb, which is a managed billing platform for companies that are having a usage-based pricing model in particular. So this can be SaaS companies, recently SaaS companies with an AI feature, which has naturally some usage-based pricing on the cost structure, and we're going to dig into that. But maybe just giving you the floor here for 2 minutes to give a quick round of introductions, and then we can dive right in.
Yeah, excited to be here, and thank you for having me. Exactly like you said, Orb is a billing platform. In a lot of ways, it's a data infrastructure solution. So we ingest lots and lots of data from companies that either are AI natives or, as you were saying, have some SaaS offering with an AI feature built into it or on top of it or in addition to their core platform offering. Typically, the companies we work with are in the segments of cloud infrastructure, AI, like we were just talking about. But we also have some companies that are on the fintech side, for example. So we work with all these sorts of usage-based businesses. One of the really exciting things about building this company has been seeing the AI explosion. Obviously been very transformative for the industry as a whole, but it has meant that these engineering teams need to, especially over the last year, as the kind of experiment has been run, they need to also start monetizing their products and bringing them to market and making big businesses out of them. And that's something that, we're excited to support some great companies like Pinecone and Perplexity and Vercel in the kind of AI sphere. So lots more coming and yeah, excited to dig into that.
Yeah, I mean, we met at this great event, Open Source for AI at GitHub on Monday. I liked how it was like in between technical talks and you were like, okay, let's get real.
Yeah.
At one point, you have to start actually billing. Let's start from the top, where does the whole complexity come from, right?
Yeah.
It's very different from the traditional, being a SaaS company that's basically a UI on top of a proprietary database. It is oftentimes on the cost structure. You have a volatile cost structure because you're feeding into the OpenAIs and Tropics of this world. And then the ROI from the customer side isn't as clear. Maybe you're already on a subscription-based pricing model. What's your take on sort of how the industry has evolved in terms of getting to grips with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're seeing a couple different sorts of players in the market. There's the bigger companies that are incumbents. You think about companies like Slack and Airtable. They're adding AI features to their existing platforms. GitHub is another good example. They're interesting in terms of how they're monetizing because they're prioritizing simplicity above all else. they really want to drive adoption of their AI features rather than really think too much about optimizing margins at this stage. I think that will change over the next year or 2 years, but obviously these companies have big war chests of cash that they'll deploy towards R&D and innovation. But I think we're starting to see them think about what are the workloads we can support, what's the margin on those workloads, and I think the monetization of those companies will evolve. Then there's the kind of maybe smaller companies, and honestly now not so small, they're growing pretty quickly. And these are, your vector databases or your compute providers or your inference providers. And these companies kind of have no choice but to charge on usage, right? I think a lot of the complexity for these companies comes on the basis that they need to select the right value metric. They need to figure out what is it about their architecture, ideally that they can pass in the cost structure to their customers. And they really need to figure out how do their customers perceive the value of their products. I think it's an interesting question because especially with AI, that's not always obvious. I think the way that one application layer AI company might be perceived is very different than a vector database might be perceived, which is very different than like a, inference provider hosting an open source model might be perceived. So I think a lot of the work these companies have to do is first figure out what is the value they're actually providing. And then there's a ton of work to actually bring that into practice with going to market, being able to charge for it, calibrating the price point. But yeah, I think we're just at the beginning of that journey.
And again, taking a step back, looking at the different archetypes of pricing models. I mentioned subscription-based pricing for traditional SaaS companies. Then there's this pure usage-based pricing. Then there's the freemium model that's basically a loss leader into your product. Then there's the developer API.
Yeah.
What we've seen is that a lot of companies that are starting to integrate are adopting sort of a hybrid model, which is probably the most complex one. What sort of best practices there?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is starting from who you're targeting and like what the audience of your product is. I think a lot of times people start with this sort of freemium model because they realize that the buying process, especially for these more technical AI products, is someone just, in an afternoon going and provisioning an API key and wanting to see, does this thing work? Does it fit into my stack? Will it work for my use case? Is it performant enough? And so I think that drives a lot of decision making in the market, as it should. So I think you're right that there's been, in fact, a lot of controversy around these free tiers. Obviously, putting aside AI in the database world with PlanetScale and going off of forever free, I think a lot of companies have started thinking about, are we serving the enterprise market? Are we serving the individual developer? Can we actually do both? And, for example, how much is a free tier actually driving paid usage? In terms of where I think models will converge and how pricing will be thought, I think companies will want to be able to calibrate their pricing differently for different sides of the market. One model that I think has worked for both small kind of free developers or self-serve motions and enterprise motions is prepaid credits. I think it's gotten increasingly popular, honestly, probably popularized by like the combination of Snowflake and Twilio, but prepaid credits have been around for a long time. I think if you think about telecom, decades ago, there was a prepaid credit sort of model to it already. But we're seeing this now in AI because with a credit model, you get a lot of flexibility. You can give someone, could be custom credits or dollars upfront so they can just start using it. And then in the enterprise, it's a good discounting mechanism. You can control things like rollovers. You can have them apply to a subset of SKUs. So prepaid credits is, I think, the example of something which gives companies a lot of room for determining what that vendor-customer relationship looks like. And I think it's a good fit for a lot of different workloads. That's one example. I think we'll see lots and lots of patterns emerge. But ultimately, I think it just starts with like, how does your customer want to buy?
And one pricing model we haven't touched upon, which is actually quite interesting. There's this piece from Sarah Tavel from Benchmark on selling work rather than AI and selling actual outcomes. And that's something that's really hard to measure, right? But if you get it right on the pricing side, you might do like, I don't know, if you're an ETL for unstructured data, you might, charge on the number of pulls per PDF and then triage based on like the complexity of the document.
It's right in spirit. And some companies are trying to do that. So I think a good example, which has been controversial, I don't know how well it's working, but Intercom has started to do this for their AI product. I think they're starting to charge a dollar amount per like actual resolution driven
Got it.
rather than, the underlying compute they're using to resolve a support ticket. It's like, okay, only if it's resolved will we charge you. The reason I think it's tricky is because you need to really make sure that it still aligns with your margin and cost structure. Taking that intercom example, it's possible that, the support ticket isn't being resolved for some unrelated reason. Maybe the answer is fine. Maybe intercom's kind of doing the best they can, but they're not capturing any of the value they're providing because, the resolution hasn't happened. So I think in general, the trend I see is we are moving closer to that. Even if you zoom out of an example that's very specific to AI, we used to have this idea that you would just go and buy like a CD-ROM at Fry's Electronics, right? And that was very much an ownership-based thing. And then we're like, okay, well, maybe you shouldn't be paying for all this software. Maybe you should be like renting it. And we got SaaS subscriptions. And then we got the seat-based model. And with seats, it's interesting because it's still very input-based, right? You have access to a platform. That platform could be doing nothing for you. It could be doing a lot for you. It's not very tied to what you're getting out of it. And now we're, in this world of usage-based pricing, and it's very clear, like you're paying for an API request or you're paying for a unit of compute. And so the next step, I think, as you're saying, is maybe we should be paying for the outcome of that compute. So I think that is the right trend. It's getting closer and closer to like, what is the market efficient end user value you're driving? My skepticism mostly stems from, are people going to be able to always tie that to cost structures? Is that actually sustainable? And I think it might work for some infrastructure companies. It might not work for some application layer companies or vice versa. I think we'll kind of have to see how that shakes out.
And I mean, that's a good point. It's tied to the cost structure. And let me double click on that for a moment there. And I mean, a lot of this volatile cost structure comes from the fact that, OpenAI and all the other foundational models are naturally charging on a usage-based pricing model.
Yeah.
I looked at some statistics and, there was some people, doing estimates on, how much did it cost to train the GPT-4? It's like north of 100 million or so. And then to keep it up, I think it's about 700,000 a day. And then somebody on Reddit made like a, cost per query estimate, which is basically the reason why you have to pass that on. But, you could see a player like, I don't know, like XAI coming in and starting out with like a model that actually for a while maybe is going to be fully subscription based, all you can use.
I think it's interesting because a lot of, especially at scale, OpenAI, of course, is productizing AI in general, like only AI. But I think there's a lot of other companies like, Twitter or X and Meta that are integrating AI into their products. And, I can't really imagine someone like Meta saying, okay, we're going to put AI at the top of Instagram and Facebook, but we're going to charge per query. It's just not like, that's not how they think about their business or business model. So I think each business in the context of their overall revenue stream will have to think about it differently. So it's possible that, putting AI at the top of Instagram and Messenger will drive ad clicks and ad targeting. And there's some kind of indirect calculus where it will work out without needing to charge for the AI itself, right? And I think we'll see that I think could also happen on X, where there's just like an ad-supported business model and you don't need to make money off of literally the AI query that the user is doing and that the application is driving. So that's one part of it. I think we'll see a difference between companies selling AI versus AI just being a natural part of the product experience. And I think that will drive a lot of differentiation. I think to your other point, I do believe that, if you are making an upfront investment like OpenAI has and training this huge model, there'll be large incentives, especially as the market matures and public investors want to see those returns quickly. I think you will see more of a push to recovering those investments quickly. So I don't know how long we can be in a world where we are really optimizing for adoption versus like economic return. I suspect that's probably not going to last very long, maybe another couple of years, but I think pretty quickly you'll see companies wanting to make back that money very quickly. And also, honestly, they need that cash, I suspect, to train the next generation of models, right? So I think there'll be that kind of feedback loop pretty quickly.
Yeah, a great slide in the beginning of the presentation on Monday, being like, we're all used to sort of the infrastructure pricing tiers, focusing on the developers. But then if you're selling it to the enterprise, you said like, don't be afraid to have like call for a custom quote, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I think a lot of developers, you look at these companies like ServiceNow or Salesforce, right? And they're like, okay, when I go to their pricing page, it just says like call us for a quote or like talk to a sales rep. And I think the natural reaction to that can often be this product, this company is not thinking seriously about pricing. I think the reality is it's probably not catered at you, right? As
Hmm.
an individual developer. It's often that there's something about the go-to-market motion of the company that requires a value sale, right? A perfect example of where, I think a company like ServiceNow or Salesforce is probably not analyzing a per customer margin very carefully, especially for an investment like AI. I think they're seeing it as like, how can we cross-sell and upsell with our existing product suite? How do we like take what we know about the usage
Hmm.
patterns and the products this customer is currently using
Hmm.
and add to that over
Hmm.
time? And that probably does involve someone getting on the phone with you, explaining to you, hey, procurement person and like VP of engineering or CRO, here's how you're using Salesforce or ServiceNow today, or CISO, and here's how you can use our AI offerings to bolster that. And I think that sort of buyer, it's just a very different style of conversation. And I expect a lot of those to be like very large, maybe high 6-figure, 7-figure add-on contracts rather than we're going to charge you an eighth of a cent per query.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's just not how those organizations are going to buy because they want predictability in their spend. They want the value sale ultimately, I think.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think the situation is much clearer for native AI companies. And, like last year, everybody was a GPT wrapper. If all you're providing is an API query and you're charging a little bit of margin on top of it, probably you're just a reseller and
Yeah.
you should be aware of that. Where does it break from, oh, this is just a wrapper?
Yeah.
I bet some of your customers are seeing that
Yeah.
objection handling,
Yeah.
in their sales process.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think, especially if you're a company that's a thin wrapper around a different inference or foundational model provider, you are definitely in a precarious position. I think this is where I think a lot of companies forget that typically, if there's something material about the company, there's oftentimes a lot of other R&D work happening that's not just the call to the foundation model. And that's typically what you will see if you go to one of these companies' pricing pages. Like there will be a list of things, whether it's like we've really optimized some file system or we've really optimized cold starts or
Hmm.
whatever it is,
Hmm.
whatever other value there is. And I think the way I think about it is you should be taking those architectural advantages and trying to somehow weave them into your pricing and the price structure you pass on to your consumer. And I think if you do that successfully, then you're less prone to business model disruption. Because I think if all you're doing is you're saying, make an API call, we charge some small
Hmm.
tax on top of it, that business logic on top of it has to be extremely valuable for you to have a defensible business. And I think if it's extremely valuable, then hopefully you can monetize that in a way that's not just a small pass-through fee. Like, for example, if you're in a compliance domain or a domain with like deep expertise required for that, above and beyond model business logic, I think you need to find a way to monetize that. And I think over time, that layer needs to grow thicker. You need to
Hmm.
provide an application experience around it. You need to make it so that someone who has access to the underlying model can't just replicate what you're
Hmm.
doing. It's not just a matter of like, okay, you inserted whatever, like a 3-paragraph prompt in
Hmm.
front of the user's query. There needs to be like a real experience built around it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's how much are you fine-tuning based
Yeah.
on the custom data sets that you're working with.
Yeah.
And that is definitely, really hard to price in.
And for what it's worth, I think we've seen a similar sort of pattern before, which maybe people sometimes forget in this context, which is we work with a lot of infrastructure providers that store data, right? And that data might be stored in something like S3. So you'll often see some companies, especially kind of modern database companies, charge for storage as a pass-through cost, right? And it's like, okay, great, we're storing your data in some bucket storage. Everyone has some rough sense of how much this sort of blob storage costs. They'll pass that through, and then they'll charge you an extra, could be platform fee, could be compute fee, and maybe a lot of their business logic and special sauce, so to speak, is in the compute, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's possible that if this class of inference wrappers persists, we'll probably see something like that, which is like, we're going to pass on the inference cost. That's going to be on the invoice as like, we
Mhm.
made this many calls. if our OpenAI bill fluctuates, like that pass-through cost will fluctuate. But then here's an extra line item for the stuff we're actually doing. So I think storage is probably a pretty good analogy to, that's not something we're going to just opaquely charge a markup on. We're just going to pass it through directly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on, like, there might be some elements, just the pure calls
Yeah.
to the model might be passed through, but then
Exactly.
let's say the vector embeddings or the fine tuning,
Yeah.
that's something that you can
That's where your
differentiate on.
logic is. Yeah. And I think that in a lot of ways, again, with this analogy of storage, that gives you maybe similar amounts of flexibility. Like with storage, you can say, okay, I want this much data in hot storage versus cold storage. You'll kind of see that in your pass-through costs pretty transparently. In this new world, you might say, I want some of my queries going to, one model versus another, or one context window length versus another. And maybe you'll just see that transparently in your pass-through. So I think unless you've built some logic to truly optimize or consolidate that work, if it really is just pass-through work, I would almost say make that transparent and work on building value on top. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Another topic that you touched upon in your talk, which I found really interesting, is how to best calibrate the freemium model. We talked about the loss leader, a free tier, which is something that you're taking risk on. Somebody might just, completely abuse it. You might want to cap this. You might want to discourage them for making too many calls. What's sort of the best practice on using that strong method, which gets adoption, obviously, but also comes with that risk of
abuse,
free rider problem?
Yeah, I think especially in AI, we're seeing a lot of companies adopt some sort of freemium model because they want, especially individual developers, to try it out. And again, I think it's because we're in this moment of time where the industry is not really stable. There's a lot of companies doing similar things, each with, I think, their own set of, architecture choices that they focused on. So they want a developer to come in and be able to try it, to experience the kind of magic of, oh, cool, I was able to accomplish this task so quickly. And I think if you have a gate of enter your credit card, oftentimes that's very hard to do. And you're going to have a lot of drop off at that moment. I suspect the most successful companies are going to unlock the full experience initially. So they're not going to limit you on features or power, but they're just going to cap it at some dollar amount. So again, with this prepaid credits, we're seeing that a lot, which is, it's not a time trial. It's not like you have 15 days. You can take as long as you want. You're going to get the full functionality, but we're only going to give you, let's say, $50 in credits. And the thing I like about that is, from a sales and marketing budget perspective, it's fairly easy to understand and account for. And I think it's very developer friendly, where people can pretty easily say, okay, with $30 of credits, maybe I can make N,000 queries, and that's enough for me to try this and see what happens and see what I can accomplish on this platform. I think another side of this that we're seeing is companies want a very smooth on-ramp onto getting customers to spend more and more. So a billing model that we're seeing is, companies will have a pay-as-you-go motion where it starts out free, you hit some limit or some tier boundary, now all of a sudden you're paying. Obviously that's great. The downside of that is you might get to the end of the month and now you've incurred $20,000 in charges, and there's a real potential for fraud, right? Like your credit card doesn't go through, your customer just doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, and companies take a lot of credit risk in that sort of model. So one thing that Orb offers, but just more broadly that we're seeing, is this idea of threshold billing, which is hard to do on a usage basis, but basically as soon as they rack up $5,000 or $1,000, you issue an invoice. If that invoice doesn't get paid, you stop their project. You basically cap that, right? And I think that's interesting because in the world of usage-based billing, and I think you intersect that with AI, it's a high COGS business, and there is fraud going around, and I think you really want to limit your credit risk.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Using these credits or prepaid credits for trials. I noticed Instabase, which actually has a pretty high ACV, I think, but they have this, $50 free credit if you sign up. You don't even have to put in your credit card, and you can play around, get the basic feature sets.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. One thing that I'm noticing more and more is a lot of companies, maybe 5 years ago, used to think about, okay, who's the buyer of our product? I think a lot of the times nowadays you're seeing that you might not have an individual developer be the buyer. Like the buyer's it's some high ACV product, you have to involve a bigger team. But the individual developer is very quickly the advocate at the company. And so they might be the ones tasked to try this out for 2 weeks and then go and tell the VP of engineering or, whoever the exec sponsor is, this needs to be a 6-figure purchase. And so I think we're seeing more and more that engineers are, even if they're on the end buyers, they are the evaluators. And so things like free credit models can still be really effective, even if it's not going to be like a very small deal, it's going to be a big enterprise deal.
And another great slide you had in your talk was on price changes. Basically, if you're updating your feature sets only marginally, trying to push through a price change is going to be hard. But if you actually mirror the feature set with the pricing, that's probably the best. And you have this chart of price shooting up and no new features.
Exactly. I think it's interesting because as we move towards industries like AI, but more generally, these usage-based pricing models, pricing is much more closely tied to products and product teams. Like oftentimes there's a PM thinking about pricing and value metrics and even just like giving pricing visibility to the end customer. And I think one thing that, because of that dynamic, is causing frustration is companies are spending so much R&D in making their product better. And truly, I think products are getting better very rapidly, especially in AI. But across the board, I think you look at these databases, modern databases are improving quite rapidly, whether it's the observability they offer, the sort of, these cold start problems, I think across the infrastructure stack. And oftentimes pricing is still an afterthought. Like oftentimes these companies are still, exactly like you said, changing pricing once a year, right? And I think that's tricky. You're delivering a lot more value, but not capturing it. I think it's just not great. I think the other part of it is when you do that price change, it's a lot more painful, right? I think businesses sometimes don't do price changes because it's a scary moment. It requires a lot of handholding and change management. You have to be as transparent as possible. I think of it as like some companies and technical teams don't do data migrations because if you haven't done one for a long time, it's very scary, right? There's a lot of careful checking that you need to do. And so I think over time, more recently, we are seeing companies, if they have the tooling to do that, do price changes more often, because once you get into that practice and you kind of teaching your customers, hey, look at all this value we're delivering, our pricing is tracking towards that. It becomes a less scary thing to do.
And I think that's a good segue also to Orb, who owns pricing within an organization. And you work with a lot of breakout startups here. I think MotherDuck, Vercel, you mentioned Airbyte. In the beginning, it's often the founder who owns product at that stage. Then it's oftentimes product. And then ultimately it's going to be a chief revenue officer.
Yeah.
But how does that typically look, and what would be best practices on who should own pricing?
Yeah, I think at the very, very late stage, you finally get a pricing team, sometimes like a pricing advisory board. That doesn't happen, I think, until the company's quite mature. But yeah, the journey is like what you were saying. So initially it's the founder. It used to be that it went from like founder or kind of exec leadership to finance pretty quickly. I think that was the case with kind of these seat-based billing models where finance owns the pricing conversation. Now we are seeing that finance is definitely a very important stakeholder. They're in the loop, but more so it is a collaboration between the product team and the finance team. So I think you'll find in a lot of growing companies that the product function has a lot of ownership of pricing, again, because the value metric is so closely tied to your pricing model. But yeah, I think, in the spirit of treating pricing like a product practice, being able to change it, being able to experiment with it, I would say that aligning it as closely as possible with product is very important. I think the place finance comes in is oftentimes you see finance bear the brunt of the pricing chaos, right? It's like, we'll change our pricing. If you're not organized and disciplined about that, it can mean that finance is just taking longer and longer to close the books because the accounting process, the accurate invoicing process gets harder. And that's one of the things we're tackling at Orb. But yeah, I think finance continues to be an important stakeholder.
And talking about Orb now, basically you've been in business for about 3.5 years,
That's right.
Started in 2021. Talk a little bit about sort of the space that you're in. What's the typical customer profile?
Yeah.
Is it, Series A companies? Is it Series F companies?
Yeah.
Public companies?
Yeah. So that's exactly right. We're working with companies typically like Series B onwards until right before public or public. And that's been really exciting because I think you get to see the business motions of these companies change pretty rapidly as they grow. It's interesting because especially working with AI companies, because the industry is so new, they tend to be a little bit earlier, but they often have the data problems and the pricing complexity problems of more mature companies because they just have to think about billing faster than they did before. I think, previously, think about SaaS companies more broadly, their margins are so good that they can defer billing until Series B, Series C to treat as a serious practice. And now we're seeing, we have lots of AI companies we work with that are realistically having to think about it pretty carefully at Series A, Series B. So that I think is generally good for the industry. The other thing we're finding is because the macro environment is still kind of squeezed, there's been kind of this repricing of SaaS multiples. A lot of companies are starting to think about their margin profile, right? And again, that's happening earlier because the reality, I think, is efficiency will continue to be rewarded. It's possible interest rates and everything changes, but I suspect that efficiency and profitability will continue to be focuses over the next decade. And that's been a very big accelerator for Orb as a business because companies are starting to get serious about, hey, I need to think about revenue and even just new product lines very carefully. I can't just have this as like a back burner thought.
This is probably the one question that you're thinking about the hardest. The obvious question, how are you pricing Orb?
Yeah, so hybrid pricing, we have a platform fee, and then we also, that comes with an allocation of included events that you send us. And then if you send us more events than that, we have a nominal overage fee. So it is a usage and subscription-based motion. And we think that's worked really well because oftentimes as companies build out their product suite, as they get more mature, they launch new products, the core platform offering is able to help them do that. And as their data volume grows, we kind of grow with them.
And you have basically billions of events every day, right?
Yeah.
You have developer native customers like a Vercel, but this build versus buy decision is really taking away that pain of having to track that for invoicing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's been interesting because, as we said, we work with very technical companies. These companies certainly know how to manage compute. They know how to build data stores. They know how to aggregate usage. But I think one of the things we've learned is even if you can solve the billing problem, most companies don't want to, right? It's not an internal team that's easy to staff. And there's a lot of genuinely domain business logic as well. Think about the subscription lifecycle, prorations, time zones. I think anyone who's worked in billing will tell you there's this rabbit hole of complexity. And so, I think we've both solved the data infrastructure piece of it, but also the kind of traditional billing business logic piece of it. And that's been great because a lot of that is repeatable across many of the customers that we work with.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's like the OAuth that, WorkOS is doing for Vercel. They could probably build it if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think the other maybe interesting thing about billing as a problem domain is oftentimes the role in an org that org plays is the kind of interface between the engineering team and the finance team. So oftentimes the engineering team might be able to build kind of their own data stack, but then finance still has to kind of go to that team and say, hey, for accounting or RevRec, give me this piece of data, or I need to understand this customer's mid-month consumption. So you get a lot of these questions that start popping up as a company grows. And I think Orb can be at the center of those two audiences and really tackle some of those questions really well.
Nice. And so what's next for Orb? I mean, there's a lot of competition in that space, hyper-competitive space, Metronome.
Yeah.
You're selling into some of the hottest companies here in San Francisco. Where do you want to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it will be scaling the existing offering. So as you were saying, we process billions of events. I think we've done a really good job of that, but our customer base is growing very quickly. The amount of both customers and the events per customer is growing very quickly. So there's lots of really fun infrastructure challenges in that. But I think the other thing that we're really focusing on is giving finance teams the tools they need. Honestly, the best case outcome for us is we work with engineering teams, they become champions of Orb and advocates of Orb, but they can stop worrying about the billing problem. They can move on to other projects, the projects that are really instrumental for their company. But finance teams, they need to close the books every month. It's an ongoing relationship and exercise. One of the initiatives we're really excited about on the finance front is more and more companies are starting to use Orb in their boardrooms, right? They're starting to think about Orb as a source of truth for their revenue, their reporting, and their core business health metrics. And that's an area we're pushing on.
Time for the call to action. Who should reach out? You mentioned people who are in the boardroom,
Yeah.
engineers and finance teams, call to action, where can they find you? How should they get in touch?
Yeah, we're at a lot of events in San Francisco specifically and New York quite often. The best place to, especially for an AI company, is withorb.com/AI or just withorb.com. One of the nice things that I think we've been able to do that especially engineers enjoy is we have a public sandbox available. You can go poke around, actually see the platform in action. It's not something that we gate for you. Like you have to talk to someone in sales before we show you the platform. So that's another avenue, which is just go play around with the product, see what the primitives are, see how they work. And I think you can get a pretty solid picture of, why folks adopt the platform and whether it can work for you.
Perfect. Thank you for taking the time on a busy Friday
Of
afternoon.
course, yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for having me.